Hello everyone, it is Al Smith here from the School of Sheen, and I want to welcome you to our final chapter of the book that we've been going through, simply entitled For God and Country, a classic book written in 1941. And I say classic in the sense that the words that Fulton Sheen said in 1941 are still relevant today. You could still use them in the year 2021. So I think many people who have been watching this series are, nodding their heads saying, yep, that makes sense even today, even today. So we're going to go through chapter 7 together and hopefully finish well. And I will bring up on the screen the text from the book. And again, I apologize in advance, of course. um, I'm not the perfect candidate to read these reflections, but still, as I said before, God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the call. So I want to share with you now chapter 7 on the topic of hope. We live in one of those interludes of history that come upon us every few hundred years. It is a time between times, the end of one era and the beginning of another, which is yet clouded in mist, that twilight zone when darkness seems so real and the light seems so far away. The whole world seems to be possessed of a sense of impending catastrophe when liberals doubt their own liberalism, reactionaries fear their own immobility, when defeat, persecution of religion, frustration of hearts, the enthronement of violence, and a gnawing fear turn the prophets of progress into prophets of despair. As the Jews of old sometimes yearn for the flesh pots of Egypt, so does the modern man look back regretfully at what he thought was a paradise on earth, when poets sang, "Glory to man in the highest," when evolution promised to make each of us gods, and philosophers taught man was the measure of all things, when novelists pictured a brave new world, when education, politics, and economics no longer needed religion, and when the laws of progress guaranteed us a world without a cross. No period in history better reflects the pessimism and despair of our day than that tragic interlude between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, when the light was put out and the best of men were in darkness, wondering if it would ever be light again. Never did the world seem darker. Economists who bargained the master for the price of a slave ended in the despair of suicide. Politicians like Pilate, who washed their hands with water, still found them red with the blood of deicide. Even the apostles, who had heard him say that he would rise again, doubted that there could ever be a victory after such a defeat. Just as the despairing of our day look back to what they wrongly think was a golden age, so the apostles, after the silhouettes of the three crosses were swallowed up in the darkness of Good Friday night, must have looked back to what they thought was their golden age, the Mount of Transfiguration. How they must have set in contrast those two mountains, the one where his face did shine as the sun, and his garments became white as snow, and the other where his face was as one struck with leprosy, and his only garment the purple patches of his own blood. How different it all would have been, they must have thought, if the Master had only followed Peter's advice and stayed there in his glory instead of coming down from the hill to set his face towards Jerusalem and the cross. But now it was too late. They had only the memory of a lost kingdom, which, like Moses, they had seen with the mind's eye, but were never destined to enter. The glory of the Transfiguration was lost. They had now only the defeat of the crucifix. Then came Sunday morning, at an hour when it was yet when it was yet still dark. A woman steals into the garden, a woman who herself had risen from the dead, for the Master had driven out of her 7 devils. If there was anyone who might have been expected to have believed in the resurrection, it was she. And yet on Easter Sunday morning she went to the tomb not to await a resurrection, but to anoint a dead body, uttering all the while the bitter plaint, "They have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him." John chapter 20, verse 13. With her whole heart absorbed in this thought, she turned away, and lo, Jesus was standing beside her. But it was not Jesus as she had known him. There was something spiritual, something not of the earth, in the risen and glorified body. Some accident of dress or appearance, through tear-colored eyes, made her fancy that it was the gardener. In the eager hope that he could explain to her the secret of that empty and angel-haunted grave, she exclaims in an agony of appeal, "Sir, if thou hast taken him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away." John chapter 20, verse 15. Jesus spoke to her one word, "Mary." He was calling his sheep by name, and there was all heaven in that word. She looked first to his feet, and saw the red scars of the conqueror of death. And then she uttered but one word, and all earth was in it, Rabboni. The birth of the Savior had been announced to a virgin, the resurrection from the dead to a converted prostitute, that all the hopeless world might know that they who slew the foe had lost the day. Before the sun had set on that brilliant Easter day, there burned into the hearts of the apostles and all the world the great lesson. Easter was not within 3 days of the Transfiguration. It was in 3 days of Good Friday. We who believe in the risen Christ cannot share the pessimism and despair of the modern world, which feels that this war is the end of civilization, the beginning of chaos, the return to barbarism, and the decline of the West. Why do the very ones who once clapped their hands at seeing the Tower of Babel rise now wring them in dripping despair as it tumbles on their heads? Why do they who once danced to the tune of evolution and progress now sing the lamentations of disillusion? It is because they started with a very false premise, namely, there is only matter in the universe, but no soul, no divine purpose, no God. Now, if there is nothing in the universe but matter with its various shapes and forms, then once it begins to disintegrate, nothing can stop it. When an apple begins to rot, it rots through and through. When dynamite explodes, it exhausts itself. When a tree begins to decay, the ravage continues until it falls. Applying that to our civilization, because the materialists have seen cracks in its walls, they say it now must crumble. Prisoners of the material, they are made captive to hopelessness and despair. This pessimism we cannot share, because we believe there is something else in the universe besides matter, namely the Spirit, and the Spirit is never so near a victory as when the flesh is most defeated. The Master was never so close to his greatest victory as when men built him a cross, for Easter Sunday was not within 3 days of the glory of the Transfiguration. It was within 3 days of the cross. There are 3 reasons for hope, and therefore not sharing the defeatism of those who, because they have forgotten their God, have lost the hope of resurrection. The first reason is this: moments of great catastrophe are often the eves of great spiritual resistance, of renaissance. I'll repeat that again. The first reason is this: moments of great catastrophe are often the eyes of great spiritual renaissance. It was not when the apostles saw Christ in the transient glory of transfiguration, but in the ignominy of a tortured man on the cross, that they were closest to their victory. Our divine Lord himself, speaking of wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes and distress of nations, made the forecast of these calamities the very motive of hope. But when these things begin to come to pass, look up and lift up your heads, because redemption is at hand. Luke chapter 21, verse 28. The reason moments of catastrophe may be the eyes of spiritual victory is because it is in those moments of defeat that man's pride is most humble and his soul thus prepared for the help of God. Israel received her greatest profits in the hour when all hope seemed gone. The prodigal was closest to his greatest joy when his substance had been wasted. It was only when Peter had labored all the night and taken nothing that he was given the miraculous draught of fishes. And in the spiritual life, the dark night of the soul, the purification of the senses by mortification, is the prelude to the rapturous joys of the Spirit. I believe we are now in such an age, of which Isaiah spoke. I will give thee the treasures of darkness. Isaiah 45, verse 3. Darkness may be creative, for it is there that God plants his seeds to grow and his bulbs to flower. It is at night that the sheep which are scattered and gathered into the unity of the sheepfold, when the children come home to their mother and the soul back again to God. Daylight deceives us, but as we awake at night, we get a new sense of values. Darkness seems to tell the awful truth. As the psalmist put it, day to day uttereth speech, and night to night showeth knowledge. Psalm 18, verse 3. Night has its wonders as well as day. Darkness is not final except to those who are without God. Applying this to our own time, the beginnings of a new era are often marked by a general barbarization. When the whole historical order is dissolved in a torrent of violence, when truth in some nations is nailed to the cross, and in others rejected in a stroke of false broad-mindedness. But since we believe in day as well as in night, and in spirit as well as in matter, we are not without hope in this hour of calamity, for only those who walk in darkness ever see the stars. We are hopeful not because this is a good world, for presently it is not. Our trust is not in the inherent natural goodness of man, but in the powers of God who can raise him from the dead. Our optimism is based not on progress, but on its breakdown. Our modern pagans despair when they become disillusioned about the world. We hope when we begin to be disillusioned about ourselves, and therein is the pathway to repentance and to God. For Easter Sunday was not within 3 days of the glory of the Transfiguration. It was within 3 days of the defeat of Good Friday. The second reason for hope is that in the lifetime of all of us, the Church has been more and more emerging into the world from which she was exiled 4 centuries ago. Nothing better symbolizes this progress. Nothing better symbolizes this progressive influence than the manner in which the last 3 pontiffs have been crowned as the successors of St. Peter. During the days of the last World War, Pope Benedict XV was crowned in the chapel of the Blessed Mother, at the rear of the Basilica of St. Peter's. In the year 1922, his successor, Pope Pius XI, moved forward in the church a few paces and was crowned at the main altar above the very tomb of him who first received the keys of heaven and earth. But after his coronation, Pope Pius XI did something which no pontiff had done since the year 1870. He walked to the front of St. Peter's, mounted a narrow staircase in the interior of the wall, and then, for the first time in half a century, stepped outside of the church to face the vast throng on the piazza, who were awaiting his blessing. But he did something more than merely step out into that portico. He literally stepped out into the world. The days of defensive warfare were over. From now on, there would be a warfare with the breastplate of justice, the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit, and the blessing of Christ. And just 2 years ago, when the 261st successor of St. Peter was crowned, he moved even still further. It was not in the rear of the Basilica, at the altar of the Blessed Mother, that he was crowned. It was not under the dome of the cathedral in the tomb of St. Peter. It was out on the very portico of the church itself. More literally still, he was proclaimed a shepherd in the world. And now, as Russia becomes the last hope of nations without faith, and is prepared to betray those nations who trusted in her, there will be only one spiritual moral authority left in the world, the only authority which has survived all wars and catastrophes up to this hour, and will survive them until the end. And as those round about us who live only on the husk of materialism and mumble their despair, thanks to Christ in his vicar, we live in the hope of a better day, even in an hour that is dark and black. For Easter Sunday was not within 3 days of the glory of the Transfiguration. It was within 3 days of the ignominy of Good Friday. The third and final reason for hope is that the strength of material opposition has no relation to the possibilities of spiritual victory. When there are only material forces in conflict, the stronger force will invariably win. If on one hand I have a force of 50 pounds, and on the other a force of 1,000 pounds, I can be absolutely certain that the force of the 1,000 pounds will prevail. But when the contending forces are not both material, but one material and the other spiritual, then the strength of the material opposition, however great it be, is no guarantee of its victory. A man stands behind Niagara Falls, or I should say, a man stands beside Niagara Falls. These mighty waters in an instant could sweep him to death and destruction. But there is within that man an immortal soul, made to the image and likeness of God, and being spiritual, he can conceive and beget an idea of how to harness those waters and make them minister to the service of man. Materially, Niagara should win. Actually, it loses. Apply this now to our own times. Let there arise one of the greatest military forces the world has ever seen. Let it meet any other material force that is slightly weaker, and the barbarism will win. But suppose that that great material force of barbarism is met not by a foe which attempts to match it in material strength, but by a force that is spiritual, however weak and mean it may seem in the eyes of the world. The spiritual force will win as the mind of the engineer wins over Niagara. That is why we who believe in Easter and the victory of spirit over matter will not be without hope for America, so long as it trusts in God. Our hope is grounded not in the magnificent plans for defense, not in increased productiveness of engines of war. Our hope is grounded in a risen Christ and a revitalized spirituality, for that lesson of the first Easter must be the lesson of our day. Easter was not within 3 days of the Transfiguration. It was within 3 days of Good Friday. The Church in her liturgy this day begs us to seek the things that are above, to rise in our minds with Christ in His glory as we await the final resurrection of our bodies. Taking this truly spiritual outlook of the world, and it is only the one that matters, be not disheartened if the externals and the accidentals, the trappings and barnacles of the civilization through which we have lived go down to defeat. We should face the hard fact that all civilizations, after a certain length of time, become encrusted with a bad philosophy and a worse morals, such as, in our own nation, the primacy of the profit motive over the human, the triumph of divorce over family life, the abandonment of morality and religion in education, the prostitution of the defense of labor by subversive activities. The effect of this incrustation is to smother the more vital forces within a nation, such as religion, morality, sacrifice, the practice of virtue, and the influence of the Church of Christ. Inside of every egg is potency for a new life, but that inner life cannot be free and independent so long as it is enclosed in a shell. In like manner, the vital Christian forces of this nation and of the world cannot assert themselves so long as they are kept imprisoned by the harsh shell of materialism and apostasy from God. And this war, with all of the horrors, may under the providence of God be the breaking of the shell of modern civilization and the releasing of those spiritual forces which up to this time have been imprisoned by the forces of irreligion. War is not necessarily the end of civilization. It may be the beginning of a new and a better world. It can be averted if we discipline ourselves from within and do penance. If we refuse to do that, it may be imposed upon us from without as a chastisement. But in any case, the shell will be broken, and if need be, a war of attrition will be the beginning of our contrition. For Easter Sunday was not within 3 days of the Transfiguration. It was within 3 days of Good Friday. The world does not yet know it, for the spirit of the world fights only for superficial values. But the conflict of our day is not merely between the barbarism of Germany and the rest of the world, but is part of a larger pattern. This war will eventually emerge into a struggle of two distinct philosophies of life, which may cut across national boundaries with the sharpness of a sword. Each of these philosophies of life will have its own tomb. One tomb will be in Moscow, and the other tomb will be in Jerusalem. One group of minds in the world will rally about a cadaver, the body of Lenin. The other will rally about the empty tombs of the one who was sentenced to death, but fated not to die. Millions of souls in the world who now hate religion because they hate themselves will prostrate themselves before an immortality long mortalized and rotted. Millions of others will lift their eyes to the risen Christ, living in a church which has survived 100 crucifixions and 100 deaths. And in that conflict between these two forces of evil and good, we know not how many swords will be unsheathed or whether they will have to be unsheathed. We know not whether the conflict will be bloody or unbloody. We know not how far distant in the future lies the battlefield. There is only one thing we do know, and that is the one thing which will right the world is the one thing which the world today believes to be wrong, the risen Christ and his church. Very powerful words from the Venerable Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen, and I hope you've enjoyed these 7 chapters in the book For God and Country. And I will share my screen once again. I did find these writings on the web, and the Catholic University of America has a very extensive digital library, and there they have the um, the actual collection of Sheen's Catholic Hour writings from 1941, and it's in a booklet called War and Guilt, and you'll be able to again read all of the meditations from that series of talks, and including the 7 meditations that we went through during this video series. So again, you can look at these writings digitally, and there was even, I did search Amazon, not always my first choice, but there is a group that has, I guess, published these talks and put them into a book form, and that would be the collection of talks for that whole series. And again, well over a dozen talks, but nice that someone put that together. So it is available on Amazon. But again, you can look at it digitally through the Catholic University of America in their website, their digital library. So, okay, so we have completed this book together, and it has been a blessing for me to come across these lost treasures, and I will be doing this a number of times through the year 2021. The next book I will cover is The 7 Pillars of Peace by Fulton Sheen. Again, also a book penned in the wartime years, but still great reading for us today. So I'd ask you to please join me for that series. And everyone, thank you. I ask you to visit my website. It's simply bishopsheentoday.com, because we need Bishop Sheen today. And there on that website, you'll find hundreds of videos, lots of audio recordings, lots of free downloadable books. Of course, all at the price that we can afford. Everything is free. So spend some time with, again, the Venerable Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen by visiting our website, bishopsheentoday.com. My good friends, thank you again for joining me. And until next time, may the good Lord continue to bless you and keep you. May the Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord look upon you kindly and bring you peace. God love you.